Thank you very much, and it's great to be here in this lovely city and also to have seen some of the bike infrastructure here and cycled and walked around a bit. So I'm going to talk about London, and as was just indicated, London is not in some state of perfection as relates to cycling, but it has, however, gone through some very interesting changes which are still ongoing and which I feel like, I've been experiencing and been part of. So hopefully this might be an interesting story for other cities that are in perhaps comparable or similar situations in some respect. I should say I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account of what happened when over the past 6 years, but obviously I'm very happy to answer questions about specifics, people, organisations and so on, events. But what I'm going to try and do is give a flavour of some of the ways in which ideas changed, specifically ideas around safety and risk, but not to say that that's the only important thing, but I think it is quite a crucial part of the story. So I'm going to start off with a sort of brief London chronology, just because I don't know, how much people know about the London political situation. So just a bit of stuff about what's relevant there. Talk about how cycling became marginalised in UK policy, and specifically, as I said, to focus on cycle safety. And I really think we've sort of seen something of a paradigm shift. And I think that's so important that I want to talk about it in some depth. And then some thoughts about the future and lessons learned that might be relevant to other places. And as I say, when we get to the Q&A, please feel free to ask me questions about any of this or related topics. I'm not going to talk about my research in great depth, but sort of to skate over some of the things that I've been involved in. So to give you a brief London chronology of some sort of important events that happened, just very, very briefly. So in 2000, the Greater London Authority was created, and that's important because it set up an authority, effectively a regional authority that covered London, and the Mayor of London as being in charge of that. The Mayor of London has the biggest personal mandate of an elected politician in the UK because they are directly elected by millions of, well, the population of London is 8 million, voters obviously less, but, directly elected by a lot of people. And that's quite important because that creates a figurehead, somebody who is responsible for stuff. And transport for many of these years was the main thing the mayor has been in charge of. In 2003, you may know that London congestion charge was introduced. That, I think, is important. Not because of anything it did specifically for cycling, but because of a culture shift in terms of driving and away from driving that has been in train for some years now. We have had a substantial mode shift away from driving towards largely public transport. And I think that's really important, the culture of the city and the way people think about transport. We had bus priority and pro-walking policies in the early 2000s, which made people more multimodal. And central London road space was reduced by 30% in terms of the allocation for private motor traffic. So really quite a substantial shift away from providing space for cars. In terms of cycling specifically, in 2008, the London Cycle Superhighways were announced, and these were to be 12 routes that would be like a clock face from central London to further out areas. And that's when they were first announced as being this big strategic cycling scheme. In 2010, our cycle hire scheme opened, and in my view, that was largely important because it made cycling part of the public transport network, and it became something that started to fit in with multimodality in terms of the transport network, and because it potentially got people cycling who perhaps did not look like your traditional London cyclist, which I'll come on to in a minute. In 2013, we had a very important document published called the Mayor's Vision for Cycling, which set out a new generation of routes that would be separated from motor traffic, that would be of a much higher quality than we had hitherto experienced. And in 2016, the first 2 really high quality, full length international standard routes opened. So I just really wanted to give you a flavour of those, just so you could see what we got and how it differed before I go into the main body of the talk. So this is the cover of the Mayor's Vision for Cycling, and you can see Big Ben up there. You can see a cycle track leading up to Big Ben and to the Houses of Parliament. And when this was published in 2013, I thought, are we ever going to see this? This is phenomenal, but will this actually ever happen? And just a couple of months ago, I was there at the opening, and I felt like crying because it was there. It was built, and it does look like that. If you're ever in London, do go and see it. But just to give you a quick sense of how this route changed, these pictures are all from a cycling blog, which I shall refer to blogs again shortly. But the top picture shows a before, and the second picture shows an after. So you can see, a good quality segregated track afterwards, whereas before you had a narrow painted lane. Mainly the top picture was a kind of thing we've had for many years in the UK that's been called cycle infrastructure, that kind of painted narrow lane. A couple more pictures. So you can see there on the embankment, you would have been cycling up inside, a queue of motor vehicles. Cycling on the sidewalk is very much frowned upon in London. So if you tried to do anything else, you'd be yelled at. So you'd be squeezing your way up there. Now, again, there's a wide track and there's been space taken from the road, not from the sidewalk. And on the right, you can see, again, a sort of painted bike and also half a sidewalk for cycling, so sort of two bits of not very good provision, and now there's a wide track there. Just one more image. So at the top there, you've got a classic left hook risk. You've got a lot of motor vehicles turning left across the cyclist path potentially. You've got the cyclists walking on the pavement with the kids, and at the bottom you've got a segregated track and a bus stop bypass. So that gives you a sense of the change in quality of provision that we've experienced. This is only several routes. Most of London does not look like this, but getting this has really been quite a step change, particularly on these iconic sites. So I'm going to take a step back and just talk about the situation we were in traditionally in respect of cycling in the UK, and why this has come as such a welcome surprise to many of us. So this graph gives you a sense of the transformation that we've experienced in the post-war years in the UK. And the red line is the distance travelled by car, and the green line is the distance travelled by bicycle since 1952. And just a couple of things to highlight. In 1952, we were a largely multimodal society. People travelled by car, by bike, by bus, and by relatively similar amounts. But by 2011, much earlier than that, we're in a very different situation, a very car-dominated society where the car is the natural choice for many journeys. This just amplifies the bicycle line, because you couldn't really see the bicycle line before. But when I first saw this I found incredible, because I'd always assumed that cycling sort of had a slow decline, but it doesn't. It drops off a cliff in the 1950s. We go from cycling being a normal mode of transport within about 10, 12 years to it becoming something that only those who have no alternative would consider doing. And as you can see, we haven't really much recovered since then. The point I just want to make here is this did not just happen. This was something that was actively planned for at a time when cycling levels are relatively high. And I can't go into any detail on this, but I'll just show you a picture. And this is one of my favourite pictures from Traffic in Towns by Colin Buchanan in the 60s, a really great read, and one that they actually released as a low-price paperback, which is unusual for a transport planning book, I think. And this is the vision for Tottenham Court Road. If any of you know London, Tottenham Court Road this is the vision of how it could be remade. And you can see that there's classic style, the pedestrians are up on the upper level, there's plenty of space for cars, this being London, there's space for buses, and I've highlighted the cyclist for those of you with poor vision, because there is indeed a cyclist and he or she is on the sidewalk. I can't tell if they're pushing or cycling, but they're, that for me really illustrates at a time when cycling levels were still, relatively high, that cycling was just designed out of planning, and that the future was seen as being in the car, as being the car. And I would like to think optimistically we're now starting to get to a different position where we look at our present similarly and say we don't want this, we want something else, because that's what they were doing then. That's not what society was like. Now this process of planning really to design out cycling has had big impacts, and I'm now going to move on to say something about safety and risk, which is what I mainly want to focus on. So the way we think about risk and safety in relation to cycling. But first, something on the actual impacts on safety. So this graph, I think, is a real eye-opener. This is the fatality rate in Britain per billion miles cycled. So this is a proper rate-based measure of safety. If you cycle 10 miles, how likely are you to die? incredible. 1950 to 2010, you see the cyclist fatality rate increasing threefold during those years, those, the 50s and 60s, up until a peak in 1970. And what I would highlight as well is that we're only just better than 1950 by 2010, which is not really very impressive. We've pulled down again from that peak, but still cycling is only slightly safer per mile than in 1950. And just to highlight how that differs from the broader trends, this is a graph I calculated using information about all vehicle kilometre travelled. So this is what is happening overall to the risk on the roads. It's generally in substantial decline per kilometre. But for cycling, you see, you've got a very different picture. So cycling in those years, the 50s and 60s, is getting much more dangerous for your daily commute, whereas we've managed to make largely driving safer and safer year on year. So there's long-standing impacts of this, I think, and I'll just highlight a couple before I talk about cycling and safety in London more specifically. So one of the things that happened was that cycling was not normal. Cycling was designed out of public space. Cycling was designed out of policy and planning. It was not even seen as a transport mode. So in the UK, we had debates during the 50s and 60s what to do about public transport. You may have heard of the Beeching report, but that was a report that talked about closing many rail lines. But it was discussed. Rail was a form of transport. What should we do with rail? What will we do with these lines? That didn't happen with cycling. Cycling wasn't even discussed in those terms. There was no debate, what should we do about cycling? It didn't happen. And what happened to cycling then was quite interesting. This is a lovely leaflet from the 1950s, in fact, from some archival work I did. Basically what the leaflet is saying is, oh no, our children are not cycling. They're all watching TV. They're all going to the cinema. They're not doing healthy outdoor pursuits such as they should be doing. And the reason I'm highlighting this is just to show you that cycling became something outside of transport. It became for leisure, it became for sport, it became for children, it became something that people would do out of choice, not a proper mode of transport. It became something that was part of the private sphere. Here you can see it's part of the family sphere. I'll just also highlight, you probably can't see it, but at the bottom it says, the problem is we're too much inclined to believe everything we see in the papers. That's how the idea has got about that cycling is dangerous. So, people have got the idea from the media that cycling is dangerous. They won't let their children cycle. We need to let children cycle. But so the key point here is it's out of the public sphere. It's into childhood, play, leisure, sport. And I don't know about you, but I've always felt that for my country, the UK, is a place where people don't like children very much. And once something becomes seen as for children, it becomes devalued. The other thing, of course, that happens in terms of this devaluing is that cycling is seen as something for those with no choice. So it's also seen as something for low-income adults. And if you've got a background in public policy, then, there's a lot of stuff around how if a service is seen as residual only for the poor, that's also a problem. So cycling, is devalued, marginalised in a whole range of ways. Another thing that I'll come back to in a moment is that the solution for this in the 1950s and 60s, for this problem, children not cycling, is seen as cycle training or cycling proficiency. And that is sort of seen as the main answer to the problem of children not cycling. So cycling is seen as something to be enabled by training individual children. And not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but when that is seen as the whole solution, I would suggest that is a problem. It's part of an individualized model, and it's also part of a sort of deficiency model, that cycling is seen as problematic because it's not driving. It's other. It's not a proper form of transport. It's something else. So just to summarise, you may recognise the person in this picture. This is Margaret Thatcher on the M25, the expanded, the motorway around London. She was famously associated with the great car economy, but certainly cycling has been outside the mainstream for many decades in the UK, not just marginalised by Thatcher, but by many other politicians as well. But a couple of things that that have been really important. Cycling has been seen as local. Even when cycling has been thought of in terms of transport provision, it's something that's small and local. It's not strategic and big and sexy. It's something, it's little, small scale, local pots of money. So it's also seen as something that's cheap, which you would think would be an advantage. But no, because what's prestigious in terms of transport projects are expensive projects, large motorway schemes, large tram schemes, large train schemes, whatever it is, but something that is seen as cheap for minorities, for marginalised groups and so on, is not seen as prestigious in the same way. And one thing that's been an ongoing problem for us is that even when policymakers started to think about cycling as a good thing, not a problem, but something they would like to have more of, it's still seen as primarily an individual responsibility. This is important. So for many, for a couple of decades now, the main way that the politicians, policymakers in the UK have tried to increase cycling has been to encourage people to cycle, to tell them that they should cycle, to tell them about all the arguments, which are true, many of them, the good reasons why you should cycle, that it's cheap, it's healthy, it's environmental, and so on. That has been the main thing, a sort of a very individualised view of policy, not, we should provide for this mode, but we should encourage people to use this mode. And I think that's really important because it's kind of meant that we're stuck in this individualised paradigm, even when we're trying to do something good, and even when we're trying to increase cycling. So I'm going to kind of illustrate that a bit more in relation to cycling safety, really, and how we talk about cycling safety, because I think we're often still stuck in the past and stuck in the old ways of seeing things. So bike safety in London. So I've already alluded to the fact that cycling safety is seen as a problem. In London, for a long time, even within the UK, London has been seen as the place where you have to be crazy to cycle. I would talk to people 10 years ago, and I still do. I would talk to people from other parts of the UK and mention I cycled in London. They would suck their teeth and say, "Ooh, you must be brave." So cycling in London, the safety problem has been high profile for some time. And this just illustrates in terms of the percentage of casualties. So this is numbers of killed and seriously injured casualties in London in 2011 by mode of travel. So you can see what we call the vulnerable modes are high up there. And cycling, 20% of KSI casualties in London being cyclists. And as the Road Safety Action Plan points out, pedal cycles accounted for 2% of daily journeys, but 20% of KSI casualties in London in 2011. This became increasingly high profile, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, but just to highlight that it was flagged up in Transport for London reports. It was seen as something increasingly seen as a problem that had to be dealt with. And I've just highlighted, these are some figures from 2011 that show that the numbers of killed and seriously injured cyclists was going up. It was going up year on year at a time when, certainly for motorised vehicle users, those numbers were going down. So this became an increasingly prominent political problem, but how to deal with it, and which is what I'll come on to in a minute. But just the quotes underneath, because I thought I'd throw in some bits from my research that gives you a sense of how people talk about feelings about cycling and risk in London. So this was some interviews that I conducted as part of the Cycling Cultures project. People saying things like, "I don't want my son to go on the roads before he's at least 9, because I think it's going to take that long for him to really, really understand that cars can kill you." Cycling in the bus lane, something that bus lanes have been quite a core part of cycling provision in the UK for many years. Cycling in the bus lane can be okay as long as the bus driver isn't out to kill you. You're cycling along and you think, you're aware of this behemoth behind you, and you think, right, okay, where's the bus? This kind of constant sense of vigilance and fear. Every time I get on a bike, I come within this far of being mashed. So these kinds of stories, obviously cycling is a wonderful thing in many ways, but these kind of stories, when you do interview research, come up again and again. And it also comes up in surveys. So this is from a survey that Transport for London do regularly called Attitudes to Cycling. And, the positive thing is Londoners say cycling is becoming more popular, it's interesting, it's enjoyable, it's convenient, it's fast. But 90% believe traffic makes people afraid of cycling on the streets of London. So very positive attitudes towards cycling alongside concerns about risk. Now, I'm going to spend a little time sort of arguing about how attitudes to risk have changed. I think that we are in the process of changing from one paradigm to another. And the old paradigm, as I was saying, is very individualizing. So this tradition of cycling being seen as an individual choice or responsibility. You know, it's not something that's provided, it's something that you choose to do. And within this sort of traditional paradigm, which I'll illustrate in a minute, cycling is seen as dangerous. This risk problem is attributed to cycling and cyclists. So cycling is seen as dangerous, and there's a focus on individual solutions. Let's get people to wear safety clothing, let's train them, let's, you know, make them better cyclists. And that's the solution. It's an individual solution. And I would argue it focuses on the victim, and so it's associated with victim blaming and also with stigmatizing. You know, it's focusing on the cyclist. What should the cyclist do differently? And I think it has a long history. It's called road safety, and you can see here. This is a book. This is from some of my archival research. This is a book telling children, teaching children about road safety, and it's something to look at, really. So the one on the left says 7 little children showing off their tricks. Clever one rode no hands, and then there were 6. So yeah, don't ride no hands, you deserve to die, kids, under a bus. And the second one says 2 little children riding fast for fun. One was riding much too fast, and then there was one. Yeah, there might be a car coming around the corner, and then you'll be dead, and it will be your fault because you cycled too far down the hill. This is the dominant paradigm in road safety. As I mentioned, it's kind of a deficiency model. It's like cyclists are wrong, and ditto pedestrians, to be honest. Cyclists are wrong because they're not in cars. And there's a lovely phrase that I always remember that comes from a 1981 cycling consultation paper, early in the Conservative years, where this phrase is used. Cyclists are exposed and vulnerable. Bicycles are not as stable as cars. Where cyclists are involved in accidents, their machines give them almost no protection. So it very much, something is wrong with cyclists. This one I love. This one is from 1984, when London hosted a conference called Velocity, which is a high-profile annual practitioner conference that moves around. And generally, the host city shows how great it is for cycling and all the great projects it's doing. So imagine all these Dutch and Danish people and so on coming over to London to hear what London's doing. And this was what London showcased. Cyclists, will your next right turn take you to the hospital? And on the right, now the nights are drawing in, it's even harder to see cyclists, which maybe was intended to mean motorists take more care. But given that we know that when cyclists are killed or seriously injured, a key defence of the motorists involved is often I couldn't see the cyclist, which tends to get you off every time. The way this has contributed to, a toxic culture around cycling, I think, I think it has. And I think what this kind of thing has led to is really cycle planning that has marginalised cycling. And there's a lovely illustration here by a Dutch artist, would you believe? Of this? This is the London Cyclist by a Dutch artist. And we've ended up in this kind of vicious circle, really, where individuals are told to wear personal protective equipment. Cycling is then seen as risky. If you look at that, that looks a pretty risky thing that person is doing to look like that. Cycling is then seen as being for risk takers. That person must take a lot of risk. Look at them doing that risky activity. Cycling then attracts more risk tolerant groups. In London, cycling is disproportionately concentrated among men in their 20s and 30s. Planners then assume cyclists are risk takers. And this kind of perpetuates planning for this image of this person. And this is what we've kind of been stuck in. And I think it is really linked to discourse around risk and safety. And we get, this was a document produced, I think, around 2011 by Transport for London, Cycling Revolution London. And that image of a cyclist who admittedly is not wearing a helmet, but who looks like fast, risk-taking, speedy cyclist. That is the vision that people have of cyclists often, and planners have as cyclists. So one of the things that happened was that we got designs that even when we started building in London more cycle infrastructure, we got designs that prioritised the fast commuter. And there was an assumption that this person was happy cycling with fast motor traffic, and this was the kind of thing that we designed. This has been changed now, but this was Cycle Superhighway 2 going through East London, and that kind of thing. There's a left hook risk because many of those cars might be turning left, and even more importantly, many heavy goods vehicles may be turning left. The idea is that person will be happy cycling there, and that's what you build for them. Another image of Cycle Superhighway 2. Again, this kind of thing by people who genuinely wanted to build for cycling, but for a particular image of the cyclist as being someone who could cycle there. You wouldn't imagine someone cycling there with an 8-year-old, I don't think. You certainly didn't really see them. But interestingly, the other side of this was that we almost kind of had two images of the cyclist. So there was that guy on the one hand who was speeding along, trying to get to work as fast as possible, didn't mind about motor vehicles. On the other hand, there was the more leisure cyclist. So there was the leisure cyclist was somebody who didn't really mind getting muddy, didn't mind taking a long time to get where they were going. And basically, they don't want a direct route. They're happy ambling along in a field. So we had these two images of cyclists. And the interesting thing from a discursive sociological perspective is that it kind of maps onto a distinction between poverty and leisure. There's the leisure cyclist, who's doing it in their spare time, who doesn't care when they get to where they're going, or there's the utility cyclist who's just concerned with getting there as fast as possible, doesn't care about comfort. We have these distinctions that sort of map onto the ways in which we've marginalised cycling. And it's also gendered, of course, as well. The image is it's the fast young man who's happy to go along the main road, and it's women and older people who are happy to climb over those barriers. That used to be my commute to work, actually. It's really nice, but a real pain to stop every few hundred meters to try and navigate one of those if you're trying to get to work. So we built these two types of infrastructure. We built, and we still are in many parts of the UK, routes along main roads that were basically paint, and then these circuitous detours that assume that people don't actually have to get anywhere at any particular time and have no value of time. This dual failure of planning I've described in an article as being, around cyclists never win in that kind of context. Cyclists are seen as incompetent by default because they're not drivers. Their bicycles are not stable, they have no protection, so therefore the cyclist is seen as incompetent, or they're too competent. They've dressed themselves up in all the right gear, they're speeding along, and then they're a lycra lout, so they can't win. You fall into these contradictory stereotypes, and annoyingly, my 8,000-word sociology article was summarised much, much better by a cartoonist. I'll just put that up instead rather than bullet points. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the marginalisation of cycling is these kind of contradictory stereotypes, and we get it in relation to a whole range of issues. So on the one hand, you could say, cycling is great, it's healthy. On the other hand, certainly in the UK, this stereotype that cyclists are all super fit, sporty, there's a whole load of stereotypes attached to that. Cycling is environmentally friendly. Cyclists are all, fanatical tree huggers. So it kind of gets you either way. I think I've probably got about 10 minutes or so left, so I wanted to say something about how things changed more positively. And I think there's another paradigm in responding to risk. You can respond to risk by saying, okay, let's sort these cyclists out, let's make them wear lots of stuff, let's train them, let's make them better cyclists. Or you can make it a public policy problem, and that's the latter has been what's happened in London increasingly. So just to go back to this, if in the individualising paradigm, cycling is seen as an individual choice. When that risk is socialised, cycling is seen as a public service or system. It's something that is provided for, and it's not the cyclist that's faulty, it's the system that's faulty, potentially. It's also the socialising risk paradigm will also not see individual cyclists as dangerous. Cycling is a safe mode. Cycling is made unsafe because of the fact that you have to mix with heavy motor vehicles. So under this new paradigm, it's not the cyclist that's seen as primarily responsible for issues around safety and risk. It's the environment. It's the context in which they have to ride. Going along with that, it's more of a focus on collective solutions, changing the cycling environment. If cycling is a public policy issue, if it's a public policy problem, then you don't fix individuals. You don't tell them to do something differently. You don't tell them to be more confident. You actually change the system. And it's also then associated with holding politicians to account. And I think that's really important in London because you had the mayor who was seen as responsible for transport. And moreover, when it was Boris Johnson, was seen as being a cyclist. So was seen as being even more responsible. But you've got someone to hold to account. So it was kind of politicising something that had been seen as an individual problem, an individual tragedy, or an individual risk. So to say something briefly about how this changed, there were a load of things from sort of from around about 2009 started to change. There was increasingly greater mobilisations, greater political action around these issues, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. We also saw some really prominent campaigns from some leading newspapers, the Times, for instance. The Murdoch Press, not known for its coverage of these issues, but ran a really strong campaign called Save Our Cyclists. Other newspapers also ran stories where they said something needs to change. The mayor, the government and so on need to take action. And this was really important. This was such a big shift. And just to give you a sense of how this changed, this is a graph that comes from an article that I'm a co-author on, where we looked at how coverage changed in the London Evening Standard. So we looked at cycling fatalities. Did they get into the London Evening Standard? And as a comparator, we looked at motorcyclist fatalities. And what you can see here is that from around about the mid-2000s, you go from a situation where you don't get many of the cyclist deaths covered, as with the motorcyclists. You get to a point where nearly every death of a cyclist in London is getting covered in the London Evening Standard, which is something that politicians and policymakers read and take account of. So we had this shift whereby the media were increasingly covering this issue, and they were covering it in a way as well that would report that things needed to be different in line with this kind of socialising risk paradigm. Of course, it wasn't just the official media. Some things that were really important in this story were the role of bloggers, people who in their spare time often, writing about a subject that was nothing to do with their day job necessarily, learning about it and writing often really very detailed accounts of what was happening and what should be different. So this guy's called Cyclists in the City, Danny Williams, who became very influential and wrote a blog, communicated a lot on Twitter about cycling in London and about what needed to change. And when he tweeted something like incredibly weak plans for cycling at Major Junction, policymakers and planners took notice of that. I had a student who was doing a PhD on this issue and spoke to people who said, we take notice of this kind of thing. Interestingly, the blog that actually started it all off was this I always find entertaining. This is somebody called Freewheeler, who I think really a lot of stuff is down to, who ran a blog called Crap Cycling and Walking Waltham Forest. And why that's funny for a Londoner is this is not Waltham Forest. It's not Camden. It's not Islington. It's not even Hackney. It's part of outer London. It's very little known outside of London. So this person was living in Waltham Forest and they were writing about how awful they thought it was for walking and cycling. And their first post was about a cycle stand that had been obstructed by a local business. So really parochial, but it became a microcosm for everything that was wrong about cycle planning in London and about marginalising cyclists. So there was a whole, the importance of the media, traditional and less traditional, was really great. And I think just a few things to highlight about the importance of the blogs. So this was social media. People can share text, pictures, videos instantly. The importance of people being able to see videos and pictures was really important. People could imagine what might change. The bloggers also often tried to speak for the non-cyclists. They were really trying to get away often from this image of the man in lycra zooming down a main road at speed. They were trying to speak for the people who didn't currently cycle, which was kind of interesting. A couple of other things that were important. Blogging allows anonymity. So sometimes the people who wrote these blogs were people who had planning roles, and they could write like this because they could be anonymous. So, it allowed them to speak differently. It also democratized expertise. In London, we have some quite good open transport data, and people can take that stuff and they can represent it. And that was really important because it meant that people could use the facts, analyze figures in different ways. So, for instance, it became apparent that cyclists were the majority vehicles on many rush hour bridges and roads in London. And that was incredible to see that and actually to share that fact. All the injury statistics could be presented in different ways. I haven't got time to talk about it, but the way that you think about, the way that you talk about and conceptualize risk and injury is really socially constructed, and people put forward different interpretations. And it also, as I've suggested, helped to reframe the debate away from how can we make individual cyclists, behave differently, feel safer, be safer, to what are you going to do about this, Mayor of London or whoever it was, to make cycling safe. Just to give you a couple of examples of the use of data. So these are people, entering central London in the weekday morning peak by mode of transport. And this is Transport for London statistics. And what I'll just highlight is that between 2000 and 2011, there's a real shift if you look at the balance between people driving and cycling. Public transport is very dominant. London is a public transport city, but in 2000, there were 10 times as many people coming in by car as by bike. By 2011, it's only double. So that's really important. If you're a planner, you're a politician, you suddenly see, actually, these two modes are getting more comparable. This is not a case that it's a small minority cycling and most people drive. That's not the case at all. This graph I just really highlighting because it is a graph that Danny Williams from Cyclists in the City used, and he used census statistics to say, well, actually, people in inner London, are not driving to work in large numbers, and in some boroughs, more of them are cycling than driving. So presenting these figures and saying, look, cyclists are not a small minority; they're a growing number, and in some cases, there's more of them than there are drivers. One positive thing that we saw along the way was that the proportion of people who said that there was too little investment in cycling grew alongside investment in cycling growing. So this is a positive thing, and this shows a shift in paradigm, I think. As you invest more in a mode, as you make it seen to be something that you put large sums of money in, people look at it and say, they're not spending enough on that. It's really interesting how that happened. So as I've looked at how these figures changed year on year, and investment in cycling has gone up really substantially in London, but more and more people are saying there's not enough investment in cycling. And I think that is a good sign that the debate has shifted and that people are now saying cycling is something we invest in. What's been really important as well are these kind of broader coalitions. And I think in London, what you had during these years was a sense of a growing movement, this kind of networking, the fact that there were people inside and outside established organisations who wanted cycling to grow, who saw the need to do it differently, who saw the need to get people who are not currently cycling on the roads. And I think it's also been, it's probably worth mentioning, an international coalition with research from around the world being shared. For instance, I would share work done by Rebecca Sanders in Portland or Kay here in Vancouver, and people would read the research papers. They would talk about the research papers. So we kind of share knowledge, share information, and people often within planning organisations would look at the blogs. They would maybe change what they do. The bloggers would read the policy reports and so on. And really a growth in knowledge on all sides, learning from different cities, from different countries. This slide I put in because I was looking through some previous talks, as you know you do when you're going to do a new talk. What have I in these old talks that I can use in this new talk? This was a slide that I put in a talk in 2013. Remember, 2013 was when the Mayor's Vision for Cycling came out, when it started to look like things might change, but they hadn't yet. And in the talk I did in 2013 in London, I put in this as my last slide, which talks about a protest ride that was going on that evening that was organised by the London Cycling Campaign. So that was a talk to interested members of the public, academics and so on. And I was talking about a ride that was going on to protest two cycling deaths in recent weeks. So these worlds were kind of coming together. The media, as I mentioned, was interested. The media, increasingly journalists for cycling, they were asking questions about this. And there were a number of protest rides during those years in 2013, 2014, 2015, whereby people were on the streets and saying this needs to change. And it was quite powerful when you saw these large numbers of people, say, in front of Palestra, where planning is conducted, Transport for London planning, or on the streets where somebody had died, and people basically coming out to say this should not be happening. I think maybe I've got maybe another 5 minutes or so just to say something about what changed. I shall try and do this quickly, but just to give you a sense of the paradigm shifting. So I've already sort of outlined it, but just to give you a few examples. And this just comes from a bit of research I did into an organisation called Londoners on Bikes, which was really a really interesting organisation, because they were very active in our mayoral election in 2012, and they said vote with your bike, which no one had said before. The idea that you should vote as a cyclist for the mayoral candidate who would do most for cycling. So it was a really interesting organisation. But one of the things that was really interesting was it brought people who were new to cycling activism together, doing stuff around this, and the perspectives they brought were really helped, I think, along with many other organisations, really helped shift the debate. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples before I wind up from this. That one thing that was so important in this organisation and for many other people was to frame cycling as a contestable political issue. So as I said, cycling had been seen as something that was individualised. Maybe it was a risky thing you did, maybe it was a good thing you did, but it was an individual thing. And what this kind of diverse movement did was it framed cycling as something that was political, that could be struggled over. And that's so important. So this is from my field notes and from an article that I wrote about it. And the Londoners on Bikes people often said that they'd only recently come to see cycling as political. So, what the roads are like, I only realised a year ago it was a political question, that it doesn't have to be like that it could be different, and different decisions could make it different. And people talked about how being involved in the movement had given them a vocabulary to talk about what was wrong with the roads, how they felt, how marginal they felt. And a lovely example from one of the bloggers, one of the people who blogs about cycling in London, calls himself the Cycling Silk. He's a lawyer, and he writes about often legal issues. But he said, when I put on my wig and my gown, I'm part of the establishment. When I get on my bike, I step outside the establishment. And that sense of being treated as a second-class citizen was something that people felt, but maybe they couldn't put into words before. And this quote I really like, because this is somebody who'd got involved in Londoners on Bikes after having been involved in working with young people and dealing with conflict that they experienced. And she says, peace is not just this big thing for the United Nations to sort out in conflict zones. It's something that we live with day to day, and particularly I work with young people, so thinking about what peace means in London is something I spend quite a bit of time on. So I started to think, well, there is this other space, she means road space, in which there is an absence of peace. And she goes on to say that the UN, you could use the UN Convention to think about the fact that people are not safe. They should be able to walk and cycle around their city without being frightened of being run over, and they're not. So speaking to these people about how their views had shifted, and it was really, for me, an example of a shifting paradigm, that it was being collectivised. These ideas were being brought to bear, and cycling and cycle safety was being seen as something that was a political issue. This is a quote from me, which I won't read out, but basically it's about how, if there's a train crash, you wouldn't say individual passengers should take more care. We design the risks out of train travel, even though it's inherently risky. But with cycling, we hadn't done that. We'd said to people, be more careful, or perhaps don't worry, but we hadn't really designed out the risks. So my argument is that there has been something of a shifting of a paradigm in which the risk of cycling in London has increasingly been seen as something that is a political public issue that needs to be dealt with. Sometimes this caused frustration. Andrew Gilligan, the former cycling commissioner, once said, the activists are trying to nationalise cycling risk, which I thought was quite interesting form of words. But what he was saying is we can't be responsible for everything. But that's the way that he felt the debate had gone. And just to really conclude with a couple of thoughts on the implications of all this. So what people have been trying to do in London and many other contexts is trying to get into that space. We've been in a space where, the discourses, the planning and the policy had worked together in a very negative way. And we're trying to get to the opposite, where the culture, the infrastructure, the policy all support each other. One of the things that I think is really important is culture change among experts. And that's been something that has happened, I think, or started to happen. So we have a number of current challenges. There's limits to focusing on safety, especially given the fact that the reporting of deaths in London was skewed towards reporting deaths in central London, was skewed towards reporting particular victims. So, there are limits to focusing on safety, I think. And so part of our challenge is going beyond that to talk about comfort and giving people an enjoyable cycling experience, not just one that doesn't risk killing them. We have problems about getting further change in a city that's already very multimodal. Alliances are really tricky, and in particular in London, there's a struggle among cycling advocates to reach out to disability groups and to try and make find common cause, find common ground together. We also have big issues about freight, where you get mode shift away from the private car. One thing we've discovered, you get loads of white vans, which brings its own problems. We also have a situation where change is not happening in most of the UK, where there are cuts going on. It's very difficult in most of the country, and that has an impact on London, even though not directly, because the rest of the country is really struggling. And also we have, at the moment, we've got a relatively new mayor and priorities are still being decided. So we do have a lot of current challenges in London, but I think some of the changes that have happened are hopefully quite instructive and interesting. So just to finish with just a few thoughts on what I've learnt from this that might be relevant, is this coalition. It's really important that people feel that there's a lot of people out there in different organisations and outside organisations who are interested in and who support cycling, even if they often disagree, and people will be critical of each other, but ultimately are working towards the same goals. And just one anecdote, one person I was speaking to from Transport for London, who's a senior designer there, she said, that she gets a lot of flack. People often get, if you're a transport planner, you get contacted often when things are going wrong. You get told there's a problem, you're doing this badly. But this person said to me, when I after the East-West Superhighway opened, I've never had so many compliments. People were just constantly saying how good this was and how much they appreciated it. And for her, you could tell that would make her confident to go and want to do other stuff like that, because people were saying, you've done a really good job, thank you. I think changing discourse is really important. Changing people's views in London, for us, changing people's views of what a cyclist is or could be has been really important, ensuring that we get those diverse images and that planners are thinking about their son or their grandmother or other people's sons or grandmothers or whatever, that, it's not just the person you see now, it's the person who's not currently cycling. And James will pick up on this in a second. Education is really important, but particularly education of practitioners, of ensuring that people who plan stuff, design stuff, can get away from these decades of doing things really badly, which is, it's really hard to do things differently. We've had a lot of, in London we still struggle to design bike infrastructure that has good drainage. You know, you would think that in a rainy country that wouldn't be that difficult, but it's still something that we struggle with. So really getting these things right takes time. And for people, I would say also for people to have, you know, decently paid long-term jobs where they feel like they're valued is really important. And outside London, many transport planners don't have that. Data and sharing knowledge, really crucial. So plug here for open access papers. Please make your papers open access if you're academics, really matters. People want to read them. And just finally, sometimes people oppose culture and infrastructure. And I come from a sociology background, and I'm doing a lot of stuff on infrastructure, and I really think they're not opposed. It's really important to see how they're connected, and that changing infrastructure can change culture, and that also changing the culture of the people who are doing the planning and decision making helps change the infrastructure, and that they're all related. And especially in a country with massive cultural barriers to cycling like the UK, you know, we have all these barriers to overcome, all these perceptions about cycling. And one of the things that's been really powerful about getting this good infrastructure in, I think, is that people look at it and they think, wow, you know, cyclists obviously, or cycling obviously matters. Look at that, you know, that is actually a really good piece of infrastructure, and you know, that becomes something that raises the status of cycling. So yeah, they shouldn't be opposed. I think they go together, and we still have a long way to go, but I hope that has been hopefully not too much over time, and hopefully of some interest. But please obviously ask questions or comments when we get to the Q&A and the debate. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Propensity to Cycle tool, which we've recently created for England, and this is something Rachel is also involved in, so University of Westminster, also the University of Leeds, and I'm the lead on this project. And essentially it's a tool about where to build cycling infrastructure. It's a tool that's funded by the English Department for Transport. So, I mean, I know Rachel's saying some slight negative comments about kind of cycling policy in the rest of England, and I'm not going to disagree with that, but there obviously is some movement to try to push some good things, and some places, some other cities outside London are doing some good things, and even in some smaller places there are, you know, you get the right people, you get the right momentum, you do get something happening, and there are certainly some people in the Department for Transport who are trying to achieve things, even if I wouldn't say that's the overall direction that the Department for Transport is moving in. But we've been quite excited by the opportunity to do this project, and we think it is something useful that will form part of the toolkit of local transport planners, decision makers, that they can use in their kind of business cases and use to make the case for cycling investment. And that's what we hope we're doing with this. And this is something that's been launched next week in England. It's been available for some time. It's officially been launched next week. So the question is about where to build. How do you decide where to build? Maybe we're getting some kind of agreement about what kind of quality of infrastructure do people need, do people demand to cycle on? Hopefully we're getting somewhere on that. But where do we put it? Where do we prioritize putting it? Really, we need it everywhere. But how do we prioritize? And I think traditionally a lot of it's been around, well, let's build it where it's easiest to build, maybe where there's not that much traffic, motor traffic, where the land is cheaper, where, you know, there's fewer kind of groups that are going to oppose it. Otherwise, you might build it where there's lots of current cyclists. But maybe you should be thinking, well, where's the potential? Where's the unmet demand? Where could we get more cycling if we had the infrastructure that would actually make it possible? So jumping back to something we've seen already, this is the Embankment again. You can't see, but you know, Big Ben's up there. This is pre the building of the East-West Superhighway, and what we're seeing, of course, is there aren't any cyclists. I don't think you see any on the picture at all. But of course, you know, as soon as, even actually before it was opened, there were lots of people using it when it had closed "Do not go this way" signs on it. We've seen high volumes of traffic, and already they're thinking, well, you know, do we need to cut this down a bit here and, you know, make it a bit wider? But the question, so the idea of the tool is to help inform where to build cycling infrastructure, how to prioritize that. And what it works is we have data from the census, and we were quite lucky with our census in 2011, well, all our census every 10 years, that they include origin destination data. And most countries' censuses unfortunately don't. But ours says not just where people live, but where they work. Now, of course, we can't see the individual level data, but we can see the cross-tabbed aggregate data broken down in different ways. And so we've got method of travel to work. We've got that by mode. We've got that by sex. We've also got it by age. And we have this, something we call the middle super, medium super output areas of about 8,000 people. And we can also get the distances between these, the centroids, the population-weighted centroids of these areas, and the hilliness from cycle streets, a cycle routing algorithm for cyclists. And so we can get these kind of tables about the home zone, the work zone, the number of commuters, the number of cyclists, the number by other modes, the distance and the hilliness. And we can estimate that in quite good ways. And so then what we're thinking about is what is the potential, or the potential stroke propensity to cycle between within an area or between two different areas. So we start off with the Census 2011 origin destination data, as I've just described it. And then we create a model on what's the propensity to cycle to work, because this is just commuting trips, this of course includes, as a function of distance and hilliness. And we find that these are two quite simple things, but they actually explain quite a lot of the current variation in cycling. And we think they're also useful as a way of indicating where there are a lot of unmet potential, because where you have a lot of relatively short trips in relatively flat areas are areas where you could get a lot of cycling, but in some areas you don't for various reasons, due to infrastructure, culture, physical kind of barriers and so on that make that more difficult. So we have a model in which we estimate the current propensity as a function of distance and hilliness. And then we model cycling uptake under 4 different scenarios. And we also model the potential population health benefits and the potential carbon savings from less driving under these 4 different scenarios. And the 4 scenarios are around a government target of doubling of cycling. We always have these kind of doubling of cycling targets or something similar. Then a slightly more ambitious one, well, no, actually a sort of similar one, but differently conceived called gender equality. And as Rachel said, in the UK and in most places where cycling is not a very common mode, it's gender inequitable, roughly kind of 2 to 1. So it's assuming that women have the same propensity to cycle a trip of a given distance as men. Then, much more ambitious, around a Go Dutch scenario, in which we calculate from Dutch data what their probability is of cycling a trip of a given distance, adjusting for the hilliness there. And then finally, what's really a Go Dutch plus, when we calculate a Go Dutch but with electric assist bikes. And we bring in some extra data from Switzerland here to help us, because we don't have quite enough data from the Netherlands on use of e-bikes, even though it's quite common. We don't have quite the data we want. And because there's a lot more hills in Switzerland, it's easier to understand in Switzerland how e-bikes help reduce the barrier of distance, but particularly how they help overcome the barrier of hilliness. And they essentially seem to halve how much of a disincentive a hill is. So that's the e-bike scenario. And then this exists in an online visualization, so it's an open source model, and it's got a web tool that people can use to play with it. Anyone could just go on the website, so say it's officially open from next week, and it's just there, pct.bike. And when we talk about propensity and potential, what we're saying is, the definition I'm trying to come up with, because we use these terms slightly interchangeably and trying to explain what we mean. I'd say we're trying to estimate cycling potential by using the propensity of a sort of another existing population, a reference existing population. And usually in our model, including the hilliness and the distance as the key variables there. So how do you measure what the potential is? Well, it could be all trips under 8 miles or 5 miles or 3 miles. And people have done that kind of analysis before. But clearly people are less likely to cycle a trip of 5 miles than a trip of 2 or 3 miles. And 8 miles, they might cycle it. Some people even cycle 10 miles, but fewer people will again. So if you just say all of these trips could be cycled, you haven't really said that much. And this allows a kind of a more subtle way of looking at it than just a strict, distance cutoff. We've also included heat or heat plus. I don't know, people familiar with heat? Could you put your hands up if you're familiar with heat? Very low, okay. It's by the World Health Organization. It's a way of calculating health impacts or mortality reductions from increases in walking and cycling, and I'm involved in the heat group. And it's official part of the appraisal mechanism in the UK for transport schemes to use heat for walking and cycling schemes to evaluate the benefits from walking and cycling. And we've sort of taken a more advanced version of that than is usually done, because we've used like locally specific mortality rates. We've allowed for the age and the gender of the cyclists, because of course mortality varies by age, by gender, and the likely distribution of the cycling population by age and gender changes under the different scenarios. So you get more health benefits in terms of mortality reductions if you've got an older population cycling, because of course your mortality risk increases as you get older. In fact, of course, increasing it, women have a lower mortality risk than men for the same age. So getting gender equity actually doesn't help here, but there you are. And we do 2 heat calculations because we try and be fair, and we include the net benefit from new cycling trips, but some of these trips would come from walking. Walking is not an uncommon mode for short trips, even for commuting, so we take those off. And we had to do a new calculation for electric bikes because, of course, they're not included in existing heat calculation and so on. So we did our own estimations, assuming that e-bikes are less active, less physically active, less energy expended by the person, and that they're faster, so you're doing the trip quicker. So you're getting a health benefit, but not as much. But of course, you might be more willing to cycle that bit further. And with the tool, there's different ways you can use it. You can visualize propensity or potential in an area. And you can see here shaded for London, the different areas with the different cycling levels. And this is just at baseline. You can see on the top, the centre's 2011 cycling. And you can see here the rate of cycling within that area, or not the rate, the absolute number of cyclists within that area. And of course, you can go down here. I don't know, can people read the box? The back? Sort of. I mean, what you're seeing here under a Go Dutch scenario for an area in London, a part of Lambeth, you're seeing the total number of commuters, the number of cyclists at baseline 9%, the number in the scenario is 32%. The change, the number of cyclists, the change in the number of drivers. So of course in London many people will be using public transport or walking if it's closer to. And then using the heat methodology, the reduction in the number of deaths per year, which is I think 0.3, and comes with a monetary value as they attach a monetary value to statistical value of a life, about £1.7 million. And then the reduction in CO2 based on the change in vehicle miles from car use. But as well as seeing areas, you can also see lines. So you can see the flows between different medium super output areas. And here you can see the number of commuters who are making that flow. And you can see again the same kind of information about them. But of course here we have a distance as well, which you don't have for an area level calculation. So we're seeing similar metrics calculated, obviously smaller numbers because this is just between two areas rather than for the whole, all the trips from one area, but the same principles applying. And I think something we've taken this further, using the Cycle Streets algorithm, and many thanks to them, we're able to, because we're able to query their API and pull all this data down, we can visualize the routes that people would tend to cycle on. And you can choose different routes on Cycle Streets, and we tend to focus on the faster routes. Not because at the moment that's where people would always cycle. In fact, they may go on the quieter routes or the balanced routes, if such things exist. But if you're thinking about where to invest, where to put the infrastructure, well, usually, not always, but usually the faster route would be the more direct route, the shorter distance that would get the more people cycling if you put the high quality infrastructure on it, because it goes where people, it goes the direct route that people would want to take. Of course, people have to use their judgment on the ground, but to see what is actually there and what makes most sense. And even beyond that, of course, routes come together. People are going from one destination to another, but they have to pass through another lot of origin destinations for other people on the way. And so all these come together, and then you have to think about the route network. And when you're thinking about the route network, you're thinking about potential capacity. And so you're thinking, well, when you get towards the city centre, what kind of level of capacity of cycling might be needed under these high cycling scenarios? And of course, it's easy for people to think, well, we put the same capacity all throughout the whole route network and not really think about this, or for people to, go actually narrow it when they get into the centre, because it's politically harder to allocate the space in these areas. So there's actually less space. But this can help show, well, actually, you do need a lot of space at these places. You're going to have to manage for a lot of cyclists if you're going to be trying to achieve that potential. And really what it's about is what might be the spatial distribution of an increase in cycling if we could achieve it. We can also look at visualizing cycling gain by different metrics. So this under a scenario, this is current top cycling flows in London. Very biased actually towards the kind of area. Can you see the mouse? Yeah, we sort of live around here. And obviously people going into central London. You can also then see the cycling flows under Go Dutch scenario. Very different spread. We're now seeing, I think that's around Heathrow over there. Which is there's big workplaces, not as well as the airport, there's other big workplaces around that. But we're seeing a much more kind of spread out distribution. But then if you look at carbon savings, you get a different picture. Central London disappears because nobody is driving by private car into central London for work. And so there's no carbon savings that we're modelling there. We're seeing all in the different places on the outskirts where there are quite a lot of people driving to work. And then we see, if we look at health gains, we see a different picture again. And here what we're prioritising is not the shortest trips, because people may have walked them, so they're not gaining any health benefits if now they're cycling. And trips that are a bit further. Of course, you may have fewer cyclists because people are less willing to travel further, but you get more health benefit from travelling that extra distance. So the calculation again works out a bit differently. So I think it's an interesting way about thinking, well, we want to increase cycling, and of course you should focus on the number of cycling trips, but there's other metrics that are relevant too, that you might be interested in trying to make the case for cycling and where you should invest. So, as I say, this tool is available now, but it's officially launched next week. And there's a few things we're doing in taking it further and plans that we have after that. For Greater Manchester area, what we'd like to do is include all trips, because of course commuting is only about 20% of trips and it prioritises certain people's travel but not others. But there's no one good data set that covers all trips. We do have a good travel survey, and the travel surveys are very useful and they're freely available, or researchers can just access them. In England, they're just available from a website where you can do that, and that's really helpful. But we also need, but that doesn't contain enough data to give you from each origin to each destination, because it's just a representative sample of the whole population. Well, here we need something like 20 or 30% of all trips to actually have that kind of detailed matrix we need for this. So we're using data from their transport model about the trips, the flows from each area to each other area. And then we're trying to sort of create a synthetic individual population using this process called microsimulation, which I don't have time to talk about. Potentially also, I mean, by background, I'm a health, the other stuff I do is health impact modelling of transport. So one thing we could do, and the biggest benefits will come from physical activity, but it is also, of course, interesting to include impacts of injuries and of air pollution too, and do an integrated health impact calculation. We'd like to be able to include multimodal trips. At the moment, we're just focusing on trips all the way, but particularly say for people who are commuting into London, they might not be able to cycle 100 miles into London, but they might well be able to cycle 5 miles to a train station, get the train, then cycle 2 or 3 miles at the other end. So to be able to model these multimodal trips would be really, really interesting. And of course, as I say, what we're modeling here is not what would be the effect of an intervention, but how would cycling might it be distributed spatially if it increased to these kind of levels? And what can that tell us about areas that are kind of under relatively performing at the moment and where the biggest benefits could be? But of course, it would be great to be able to actually integrate, well, if we put this in here, what would we expect? But that is a very difficult question. And of course, researchers are very reluctant to kind of, because they know how complicated it is. So researchers are very reluctant to kind of put their money on the table about that, while of course people in policy have to make these decisions or estimates all the time. So I think a kind of bit of a contradiction there, or a bit of a challenge there. In terms of individual level data, because at the moment the model works with aggregate level data. You're having a double hearing at the back, I don't know if it's something we've been doing, a related tool, is something called the Impacts of Cycling tool. Again, this is available for anyone to have a look at. It's available at a related website just with /ICT at the end. And I'm not going to have time to talk about it now, but it's something you might also want to look at. It's a sort of complement that we would hope to be able to integrate with the PCT over time. It allows us to include a much wider range of outcomes in terms of mode share, in terms of physical activity in much more detail, in terms of breaking it down by age and by gender subgroups and socioeconomic status and ethnicity and all sorts of things. And really it allows us to visualize the National Travel Survey as the baseline data set, and also to then look at what the travel patterns might look like under a range of different scenarios. But this is not geographically broken down. This is individual level data, but representative of England, or the next version will be regions as a whole. What we'd like to be able to do is have this kind of individual level refinement, which is really, really nice to see how it affects different subgroups and so on, but to be able to see that down to these small geographical areas. So, summarising, the key things about the PCT, and to extend the ICT, it's an open source tool. It's freely available. Other people can take and develop the code that we have created, as long as it's not for commercially restricted purposes. It comes up with relatively simple scenarios using the kind of propensity potential. And I think that's a strength. You could throw 300 things in the model. I think there's a strength to having the simplicity that we do here. It uses routine data. That's important. It's understandable, hopefully, by policymakers and practitioners. Certainly it's been quite well received so far. And as I'm saying, with something like the individual level approach, you can extend it, you can develop it to add in more outcomes, like other health outcomes. But also it's generalizable. And not everywhere has census data, but everywhere will have some kind of origin destination data, either from models, transport models, which the kind of planning authorities will have access to or have created, or increasingly it'll be possible to do it from mobile phone data, to get anonymized mobile phone data that can be bought, and that will give flows of individuals between areas. And Vodafone or someone have maybe 20 or 30% of the market. That gives you the kind of sample size you need for this question. And we'd love to talk to people about potential for extending the PCT to other settings. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I could potentially do a very quick demo, but I don't know where we are. We're probably a bit over on time, so I don't know if people would want that or not, but thank you.